Welcome back. We're going to take up our next topic in this video, and that topic is the local paid preacher. Now, before we jump into this, let's agree, I hope, that preaching needs to occur. Preaching needs to happen. And as the attorneys say, let's stipulate to that. Let's not argue about that or debate that. Preaching needs to happen. Now, so that's not the topic. The topic is a local paid preacher, a full-time professional preacher, if you will, that almost every church has. And so that's the topic we're going to look at. Let's do that like we've done in other times by jumping in and looking at some scriptures. When you do some research on this, the argument, the stance for having a local paid preacher, there are a number of verses that come up, and we're going to look at three here that are the predominant argument, if you will, that is used. Those are Luke 10 and verse 7, 1 Corinthians 9, 13 and 14, and 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18. Let's just read those three verses together. Luke 10 and 7 says, "Stay in that house, eating and drinking what they give you, for the laborer is worthy of his wages." 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 13 and 14 says, "Do you not know that those who perform sacred services eat the food of the temple, and those who attend regularly to the altar have their share from the altar? So also the Lord directed that those who proclaim the gospel to get their living from the gospel." And finally, 1 Timothy chapter 5, verse 17 and 18. "The elders who rule well are to be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who work hard at preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, 'You shall not muzzle the ox while he is threshing, and the laborer is worthy of his wages.'" So what I like to do is just maybe comment on those three passages and offer a couple of comments. And Luke 10:7, what we see there is this was Christ giving instruction to the 70 that he sent out to share the gospel message. So these were missionaries or itinerant preachers, if you will. They were not localized, full-time preachers. And so maybe you can use that concept, but certainly in this case, Jesus was talking to itinerant preachers, not full-time local preachers. In 1 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul is basically talking about himself and what he could partake of being one who is out sharing the gospel. So he is also an itinerant preacher going on missionary journeys, not a full-time localized preacher. He's sharing the gospel with those that haven't heard it before. And with regard to the example of the temple workers, I just want to point out that he's talking about them taking some of the food from the sacrifices. That's hardly a full-time living that they're talking about. And so, yes, they're receiving something, but let's not understand that they were receiving a full-time, full living for them and their household. And finally, in 1 Timothy 5, 17 and 18, first I'd point out that Timothy talks about elders here, not preachers. And so there clearly is a difference there. And the idea of a worker is worth his wages. So if we take that principle and say, okay, well, then let's apply that principle. And so the preacher who preaches is worth his wages. Well, okay, that's fine. So what about the associate preacher and the youth minister and the church secretary and the church accountant and the Bible school coordinator and the janitor and the lawn service and the deacons and the Bible school teachers and the ladies' Bible class teacher and the food pantry coordinator and the teacher's supply room coordinator and et cetera, et cetera. If in fact the principle is to be applied, then let's apply it. Not just pick it out, and I've heard this used oftentimes for preachers when in fact it's used here about elders and we don't apply it to everyone else. So what am I saying? I guess what I'm saying is that these verses that are used so frequently For me, they're not convincing. They're not convincing as a biblical basis for saying we must have a full-time paid preacher. But let's not get distracted on that. I will look at these verses, you'll look at these verses, others will look, and we may come to different conclusions. And one of us may be right and one may be wrong, but let's, as I said, not get distracted on that. The reason I don't want to get distracted on that is because I believe there are clearly more important issues with regard to a full-time paid local preacher than whether or not we choose to pay that person. And for me and the group that studied, there are some scriptural issues with that, and there are some unintended consequences issues like we've talked about before. And we're going to jump into those in the next video and pursue those and see if we can't understand those, both the scriptural issues and some of the unintended consequences. So we'll jump in the next video. I hope you'll join us.